And so let me begin by saying, first of all, that so the Mahabharata, the great war of the Bharatas. Bharat, of course, is also the word for India, and you've that Bharat dynasty, as it were, is also mentioned in Kalidas's play Shakuntala. The text itself is huge. And I want to begin by just reading out the first few lines from the foreword to a recent translation of the Mahabharata. Translation is not perhaps the right word, a retelling. In fact, she calls it a retelling of the Mahabharata by a woman by the name of Carol Satyamurthy. So it's called Mahabharata, the modern retelling. It's in blank verse. It's in verse, which is, I think, how it should be done, because the Mahabharata itself was written in verse. I think that now you've heard from me that all of the ancient literature of India, nearly all of it is actually written in verse. And certainly the Mahabharata, the Ramayana were written in verse. So this is a modern retelling, and the foreword to it is by Wendy Doniger, who is a very well-known scholar of ancient Indian, texts of Indian philosophy, religion, and what would be called mythology by many. She's very controversial in India, but it's unnecessary to get into that. But this is her opening lines from her foreword. She says, the Mahabharata is a text of about 75,000 verses, sometimes rounded off to 100,000, or 3 million words, some 15 times the combined length of the Hebrew Bible and the New Testament, or 7 times the Iliad and the Odyssey combined, and 100 times more interesting. More interesting both because of its attitude to war is more conflicted and complex than that of the Greek epics, and because its attitude to divinity is more conflicted and complex than that of the Jewish and Christian scriptures, end quote. So with that, she gives you a sense of the magnitude, the scope of this work. And as she suggests, that she thinks it's by far the most interesting work of its kind, more interesting than either the epics of the West, that is the Iliad and the Odyssey, both by Homer, and more interesting, equally more interesting than the scriptures of the Christian faith, right? So that gives you a sense of the enormous respect, shall we say, that she has for this work. Now, there have been attempts made to try to bring this work to the wider public. In India, more recently, as we were discussing just a few minutes ago, through the TV serial, which was, I think, televised as 94 episodes on Sunday mornings. I remember when I was in my 20s, I think it was sometime, and so it was maybe 30 years ago, 35 years ago. I can't remember exactly when they telecast it, and on those Sunday mornings the streets were completely deserted. So it was a way of bringing God into viewers' homes. Now this work is like all other works of this kind from India, a work about which the dating of which is very uncertain. It is possible that the nucleus of the story, by which I mean the core of the story, may go as far back as maybe 950, 900 BCE. I think it's unlikely to go back much further than that. Wendy Doniger suggests that there may be some elements of the story which may even go back 2000 BC. I think that most scholars would say 900 BCE is perhaps around what the nucleus of the story would be. So the nucleus would be the core story, because what is very clear is that the original core of the story would have consisted of around 10,000 shlokas. So what she's calling verses, the Sanskrit word would be shlokas, 10,000 shlokas. And as she said, it's usually rounded off to 100,000. That's how many shlokas that it's supposed to have. Now you might say, well, why supposed to have? Either it does or it doesn't. No, the reason why it says supposed to have is because there are many different versions of the Mahabharata that we have. Now, there is what is called a critical edition of the Mahabharata, which I'll come to in just a moment. But we have to remember that when people read the work, if at all they read it, they might read it. So if you were, let's say, a Hindi a reader, then you would read it in the Hindi, and then it depends on which particular version of the Mahabharata, which manuscript, let's say in Hindi, going back to this 13th century, 16th century, whatever the case may be, may have come down to most Hindi readers. Likewise with Telugu, Bangla, and other Indian languages, right? So this is why we can't say really, even with certainty, whether it has 75,000 or 80,000 or 100,000 shlokas. Now, the consensus is, and I think this is a reasonable consensus, that the work was probably, so even though the story may go back, the nucleus, the core of the story may go back to about 950, it was probably composed really sometime. That is the Mahabharata that we have now, really starts to come into shape sometime around 400 BCE, and the text continues to grow and grow over a period of 8 centuries. And what we have today in what is called the critical edition of the Mahabharata, some portions may have been composed as early as 400 BCE, and some portions may be as late as 400 CE. So we're talking about 800 years. That may be the extent of it, which of course also means very clearly, not that anyone ever supposed the contrary, but it means very clearly that there wasn't one single author of this work, right? That we might say that the Mahabharata is written by Vyasa, but that really is not a particularly meaningful remark. It is also very interesting, by the way, that Vyasa actually appears in the text as a character himself. So the author appears as a character in his own text, and in this case, he appears as the father of Pandu and Dhritarashtra. Some characters that we look at briefly in just a few moments. Right now, before I begin to sort of give you the story and outline, and the way I'm going to proceed today is essentially this. I mean, I'll give you the outline of the story in 5 or 10 minutes. Then I'm going to discuss some aspects of it. Then I'm going to take some stories within the large framework, right? You've got the outer framework of the story, and then within that, we will look at some stories in particular. And one of the stories we're definitely going to look at is the story of Ashwatthama. I had already earmarked that story for a number of reasons. And then again, I will have some general comments. So we'll have 2 sets of comments and 2 descriptions of the story. One will be a general framework, and then one where we look at some very particular stories. Because if I give you all the stories without giving you the interpretations at the same time, we're not going to be able to make much sense of what these stories really amount to, all right? But before we do any of that, I want to place it in a more general framework. That general framework is, how do we look at epic literature? How do we approach the epics in Indian civilization? And first and foremost, we have to begin with the recognition that the word epic, since I'm speaking to you in English, so therefore we have to use the vocabulary that would be the closest to what these works approximate in the experience of people who speak English. Right? That the word epic is actually inadequate to convey these works. And when I say these works, I'm referring both to the Mahabharata and the Ramayana. although my remarks today will almost exclusively be on the Mahabharata, but because I'm beginning with the general framework of the epics, therefore I'm bringing the Ramayana into the story as well. So what I say today is going to be applicable as well for my subsequent remarks on another day about the Ramayana uh, as well. Now, the word epic is inadequate for a number of reasons. The first is that in the West, the, the two epics that are most widely known are the two works attributed to Homer, right? So a Greek poet writing sometime, let's say approximately um, 700 years BCE, 700 years before Christ. And there's a lot of work, of course, that's been done on the Homeric epics. But what is pertinent for our consideration today is the fact that the Homeric epics are no longer really part of the imagination of an educated person in the West today. If you go around the streets in London or Rome, Athens, or Paris, and speak to educated people, and expect that they're all going to know the story of the Iliad and the Odyssey, I think one is mistaken. They don't. And not only that, if you speak about these epics and what the general public knows about these epics, uh, okay, very little, because these epics are part of the intellectual inheritance of the West, but they're not part of the living memory of the West today. Now, that is not the case at all with the Ramayana and the Mahabharata. The very famous Indian writer, A.K. Ramanujan, was a professor at the University of Chicago for many years, and I had the great good fortune to be one of his students when I was doing my doctorate there back in the late 1980s. He said that no one in India ever hears the Mahabharata for the first time. Now, what he meant by that was that the stories of the Mahabharata are stories that people have imbibed with their mother's milk. It's you just grow up with them, as you grow up with the story of the Ramayana. The Ram and Sita, there isn't even a Muslim in India who doesn't know who Ram and Sita are. They might not know all the details of the story, but they know the kernel of the story. And similarly, the Mahabharata, it is part of the everyday language of Indians. The metaphors, people draw on its metaphors, the people draw on its characters. There are debates that take place in the Lok Sabha where you'll be amazed how often the Mahabharata gets mentioned in some context or the other. And then you have filmmakers like Manmohan Desai. The late Manmohan Desai was a commercial Hindi filmmaker, mainstream Hindi films. He made films such as Amar Akbar Anthony. So we're speaking about someone who was really active in the 70s, 80s, 90s. And shortly before he died, he gave an interview. Some journalist had asked him, "Well, what are your films really about?" And he said, much to the astonishment of the journalist, although when I read this, I wasn't astonished at all. But he said to the astonishment of the journalist, "All my films are about the Mahabharata." Now, when you see the films, you say, well, there's no character there. There's nobody called Karna or Yudhishthira or Arjun or Bhim. But what he meant, of course, was that the plots were all drawn from the Mahabharata. Okay, and we're not speaking strictly only about the plot line, but we're speaking about the imagination of the work, what characters represent, and how these stories have played out in India over the course of the last, let's say, 2,500 years. All right. So the Mahabharata is someone that is also known to people who are really illiterate. But the point I'm really trying to establish is that the word epic is really inadequate to understand what place the Mahabharata and the Ramayana occupy in the Indian imagination, because in the West, the epic is really a genre of literature that is largely studied by scholars. Some very educated people with literary taste will certainly know the Iliad and the Odyssey, but the texts are really no longer available to most people in the West in the way in which the Mahabharata and the Ramayana undoubtedly are. Now, the other main consideration here is this, that epic culture and its texts, its stories, is one way of reading the past. I mean, I really want to dwell on that because you see, the problem in modernity is that we think that there is only one way of accessing the past, and that one way is history. We think that the way we access past is history, and history is a discipline as well, and the discipline has certain kinds of protocols. But I think India shows very clearly that many parts of Indian society have lived with pasts that have been constructed outside history. Okay. Now, what I mean by that is that we have to look at what um, we might call memory work. What is the work that memory does for a culture? So most people who know the story of the Ramayana and the Mahabharata in India are people who are not necessarily literate. I mean, if you assume, let's just for argument's sake assume that the literacy rate in India is what the government tells you it is, close to 70%. I don't think it's anywhere close to 70%, but let's just assume that we go with that figure. We're saying that there's still 30% who are not literate at all. And even people who are literate, you know, that basic literacy, very basic literacy, knowing some words and knowing how to count till 20 or 30 and knowing the alphabets of the letter, you're not going to be able to read the Mahabharata or the Ramayana, not even in the simplest version. Um, so the question is, how is it retained? It is retained because of the memory work that a culture does. This memory is the way in which the past is actually accessed in India by most people. It is not accessed by what we today call history. Okay? So when we think of the Mahabharata and the Ramayana, we have to think about memory work. And lastly, as a general observation, a very general observation, uh, these epics, and now you understand that when I use the word epics, I'm using it for the sake of convenience now, right? With all the caveats, all the advisories that I have already offered that you have to keep in mind, that these epics are, in a way, they are like uh, the ethical pegs. You know, a peg is something you hang a coat on, right? So when I say these are ethical pegs and ethical frameworks, these epics furnish the grounds to us to enable us to think about how we evaluate moral action. What is the basis of moral action? So if someone is put in a moral quandary, let's say someone is put in the moral quandary, some man suspects, let's say, the fidelity of his wife. Just hypothetical example, right? Just in the manner in which Ram perhaps suspected the fidelity of his wife Sita. I say perhaps because it would depend on what interpretation you place upon the Ramayana. Because as you'll see when we get to that next time around, one of the most famous episodes of the Ramayana is the episode of the Agni Pariksha, that when Ram has conquered Lanka, defeated Ravan in battle, then he comes back to Ayodhya and reclaims the kingdom that was his. The period of exile is over. But because Sita had been in captivity for so many years, the rumors went around town that, well, you know, since she was with Ravan for all of these years, even if how does one know that she was chaste, right? So there might have been reason for Ram, as he thought, to suspect his wife's fidelity. So the question here has to do with, so I'm using actually an episode from an epic to explain what the epics may be used for. That is, that if a person suspected the fidelity of his wife in certain circumstances, he might think to himself, well, you know, do I have the same kind of moral dilemma that Ram had, for example, right? Or if someone does something really extraordinarily wicked, you will see in the newspaper that the person behaved like Ravan. Right? So these characters, they are metaphors for certain things too. And what I'm suggesting is that these epics are very useful and have been used in India for this way for centuries. Uh, they're very useful for providing what we might describe as ethical frameworks. Okay, they provide certain kind of ethical frameworks, and they function as metaphors for life. Right? So this is a general context in which I think you should begin to view the Mahabharat and the Ramayana. Now, before I move to the Mahabharat, I want to go back to the comparison I had made just momentarily with the Greek epics, because even though I outlined the difference, I didn't say that the word epic is completely useless or it ought to be abandoned. I'm not making that argument at all. Uh, I'm only suggesting why the word epic may be inadequate in various ways. However, it is also the case that the Ramayana and the Mahabharata and what we call epics in the West, that they share some features in common. They share some features in common. And one of the features they share in common, I think it is important to draw everyone's attention to, and that is the theme of exile. Because both in the Ramayana and the Mahabharata, of course, the idea of exile is critical. It is in the Mahabharata, when the Pandavas lose the wager, uh, they have to go into exile for 13 years. And in fact, it's extraordinarily interesting because the 13th year of exile is different than the first 12 years. The reason it is different is because part of the wager is that the 13th year they have to be in exile incognito. Incognito meaning that if they get recognized, then they will have to repeat 12 more years of exile. So they have to go in disguise for one whole year. And that is an exile within an exile. I mean, it's the theme of exile is so critically important. And you see that, by the way, in the Iliad, in Homer's Iliad, and of course in the Odyssey, where the hero Odysseus actually goes away for 20 years. So one of the things that is common to the epics is this structure of exile, because when we think about the exile, let us remember that the exile is also a way of journeying. It is a journey. Lots of literature, some of the greatest literature, I'm not speaking only about epic literature, but I'm speaking about great literature and great films in general. The idea of journey is very important because in journeying, if you take that metaphor, in journeying, one journeys through life, one discovers things. All right. Uh, and this period of exile is very important because these heroes discover something about themselves. That's one reason why they have to go into exile. If they didn't go into exile, they wouldn't become the rich characters that they are. Because that period, which someone might imagine as a wasted period, is not really a wasted period because it's a critical period where they begin to uh, become aware, okay, of human failures, of their own ordinariness, and the necessity of having to overcome some of these liabilities and fears that are part and parcel of what it means to be a human being. Right? So this exile is really a metaphor also for self-discovery. And one reason why we can call the Mahabharata and the Ramayana epics, apart from their length, sometimes epics also has to do with the length. I mean, the Homer's Iliad and the Odyssey are quite long works, although there have been, of course, much longer works in Western literature. I mean, Tolstoy's War and Peace or the novels of Dostoevsky, Crime and Punishment, are longer works. And a great many other works as well. So it's not only the length, but generally epics tend to be long works, although that is not necessarily their defining feature. But I think exile, the idea of exile and all it means, as I've tried to suggest in just a few remarks, is I think critically important to the idea of an epic. And to that extent, we are justified in describing the Mahabharata and the Ramayana as epics. Now, when we think of the Mahabharata, so let me now move to the Mahabharata. Um, First, let us remember that the performative aspects of the Mahabharata are very important. You see, in India, and it has to do not simply with literacy levels, and we know that 300 years ago, the literacy levels would have been obviously much lower, as they were in the West. This idea that we go to college and everything is a relatively modern idea all over the world. Uh, and it is really in the United States that this democratization of education on this mass scale, where every second or every third person actually goes to college, really started, and that too really in the 20th century. I mean, even in the 19th century, college was everywhere in the world for a select few. The number of people who went to Oxford and Cambridge, or in the United States through Harvard, Yale, and Princeton, was very, very small. I mean, it was all men, there were no women, and they were actually theological students. Right? So it's not simply a question of literacy, because what one is saying, and one is not describing conditions particular to India when one is saying that literacy was not really a feature of these societies. And of course, when we're speaking about the Mahabharata, and we're speaking about the long period of its composition and the centuries in which obviously the story has been known, we'd have to think about how was it transmitted. Um, uh, and one mode of transmission, of course, is through your family, through your grandmother, through your mother, right? The women of the family in particular, it might be the men too, but generally because children were raised usually by women, that it's more likely that they would have heard the stories from their mother, from their grandmother, and then they might have heard the stories, some of the stories of the Mahabharata from other people in the village. But the other way they would have heard the story and would have seen it is through the kathakar. The kathakar is the storyteller. So you would have these itinerant storytellers who would go around from village to village. And in some parts of the country, in fact, this is still done, by the way. I have a collection of uh, uh, these scrolls that you get, for example, in Bengal. You get these scrolls, and so these scrolls might have 20, 30 panels. I will try to share one of these with you through that sharing mechanism next time around from my collection, if I can find it. These scrolls so may have 20, 30 panel, and the storyteller, the kathakar, begins to tell the story, and every time he gets to a different aspect of the story, he continues to roll down the scroll. So one panel would correspond to one story or some minimal aspect of that story, and this is how, if you wanted to think about it, this was moving images of that time, right? For a century, this was the way in which we thought about moving images. In Indonesia, and this is very important, because one aspect of the Mahabharata and the Ramayana that we should be really aware of is that these texts are not just part of the cultural inheritance of India, they are part of the cultural inheritance of all of Southeast Asia, all of Southeast Asia, uh, Thailand, Burma, Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia, nowhere more so than in Indonesia, nowhere more so than in Indonesia. In Indonesia, I'm talking about today, and I'm talking about what it was like 500 years ago. We have ample evidence of the extraordinary influence of these epics and what might be called the Puranic imagination in India. So some of the stories would be drawn from the Puranas as well. And the Mahabharata, in some sense, can also be considered part of the Puranic literature, right? These texts, such as the Vishnu Puran, Shiva Puran, Brahmavaivarta Puran, many others that started to emerge sometime in the beginning of the Common Era. So that's what they're called, the Puranas, a large number of texts. However, what is important only here is that in Indonesia, we know for sure that for centuries, the Mahabharata and the Ramayana have been the principal texts which provide the cultural sustenance to the people of Indonesia. or what is now called Indonesia. And this is all the more remarkable because, as you doubtless know, that when you move outside Bali, which is Hindu, although their Hinduism is very different than our Hinduism in India, but outside Bali, Indonesia is overwhelmingly Muslim, overwhelmingly Muslim. And what is extraordinary is that as Muslims, they have absolutely no problem whatsoever in embracing the stories of the Ramayana and the Mahabharata. It is not clear that the Mahabharata is, let me rephrase it. It is, I think, quite clear, I should say rather, that the Mahabharata to them is not predominantly a religious text, not to them, right? Which is why even as Muslims, they can embrace the Mahabharata and the Ramayana. And of course, they're embracing on the basis which I had suggested a few minutes ago when I was suggesting that, these are the epics which are like the pegs on which you hang a metaphor. The parables drawn from these furnish the basis for moral action in daily life. All right. So it's really quite an extraordinary phenomenon to see, for example, these the puppet plays. Wayang kulit is what it's called in Bhasha Indonesia, this art form where they use the puppets, and with the puppets they they enact the stories from the Ramayana and the Mahabharata. More so the Ramayana than the Mahabharata. Just as in India, you will find that temple sculpture draws overwhelmingly, when it does on the epics, it draws overwhelmingly on the Ramayana, not on the Mahabharata. Okay. So going back to what I was talking about, I was suggesting to you that the performative aspect of the Mahabharata is very important, because how was the stories transmitted? They were transmitted. You heard it through your families, through your mothers, through the women of the family. Then children and adults would have seen the kathakars perform it. And I'm only really giving you the outline of this because there are various ways in which some people, when they began to enact it, they would begin to live the character out in their daily life in various ways. So you see, the Mahabharata, and the Ramayana, these two epics, these gigantic works of the Puranic imagination, inhabit our bodies physically in many parts of India. And there are countless traditions of storytelling of the Mahabharata and the Ramayana. I mean, there are Muslims traditions of telling the story. There are Buddhist traditions of telling the story. And of course, among the Hindus, there's enormous variance. And then again, you would have to look at the particular linguistic and regional traditions from and what they have done with the Mahabharata and the Ramayana. I mean, no one really has a monopoly on these works, if I may put it to you in this fashion.
Why did they become, or how did they become so popular in Southeast Asia?
Oh, that's a long story. But the short form of that story is, and when we get to this, because this is somewhat later in history now, but most of Southeast Asia was under the rule of Hindu kings. Most of Southeast Asia. If you go to Thailand, one of their old capitals is called Ayutthaya. Guess what is the Indian city? Ayodhya, for which it is named. And it was one of their former capitals. So Bangkok is a capital now, but their two former capitals were Sukhothai, which is in central Thailand, and Ayutthaya, which is just a little bit south of that. Ayutthaya is between Bangkok and Sukhothai. This part of the world came under Hindu kings. It was Indianized for centuries. When I had been to Indonesia many times, but in 1998, I went to a place called Prambanan, which is a temple complex. And this temple complex goes back to the year approximately, I'll just give you a rounded out figure, approximately 1000 CE. So it's about 1000 years old. It's a UNESCO World Heritage Site. It's one of the most important temple complexes in the world. These are Hindu temples in Java, not even in Bali. Bali is predominantly Hindu today. Java is not. It's predominantly Muslim, 95% plus Muslim. Okay, and this Prambanan is not very far from Yogyakarta, a very important cultural site and one of the most important cities in the history of that part of the world for centuries. And Prambanan is this temple complex, and the friezes, that is, the sculptures on the outside walls, tells you the whole story of the Ramayana. There are dozens of such sites all over Southeast Asia. Okay, and this is the subject of study by dozens of scholars. The transmission of Indian culture to that part of the world, and there are major writers who from that part of the world who will tell you that the Ramayana and the Mahabharata don't belong to India. They're very clear about that. That this is part of our inheritance too, and as far as we're concerned, these are our stories, you know, right? Which we should be happy with. You know, some Indians get possessive and say, no, now they're claiming it. You know, it's like the whole dispute over yoga. You know, what is yoga? Where did it start? What they're saying is that this has now become part of world culture, and these stories are so much a part of our everyday life that we breathe them, we live in them, we enact them, we become the characters in the story sometimes. And this is really emphatically the case in a place like Indonesia. But we will come to this chapter about the Indianization of Southeast Asia much later on. Okay? So when we're looking at the Mahabharata, what I've been trying to draw your attention to is how the stories have been transmitted, the performative aspects, and I think it was meant to be performed. So we may be losing out something, which is one, and just only reading the text, which is one reason why it's very important to go and watch performances. I recently saw a performance of the meeting of Karna and Kunti, Karna Kunti Samvad, on which Rabindranath Tagore wrote a fantastic story or play, 100 years ago. And I saw a Kathakali representation of that at the Kerala Literary Festival in January this year, because the expression on the face is so crucial, that when she breaks the news to him, that I'm your mother, how it is performed and enacted tells you a great deal. So I think we should unquestionably bear that in mind. Now, there are some other unusual features of the Mahabharata, very broadly speaking, once again. And then from there, I will move on to the general outline of the story. And then I will describe some more specific propositions about the Mahabharata and go over some stories. But some of the unusual features are that it used to be said, my mother told me that, and then I heard it from a great many other people in different parts of India. So this was not just true of North India. That's why I mentioned this. But we may have to revise this view now. And what am I referring to? What my mother told me, that because when I was growing up, I found that there were some religious texts that she was reading. And I found out that her sisters, my aunts, were also reading those texts. And those were Tulsi Das's Ramcharitmanas. So that's the most well-known version of the Ram story in North India, and people will generally read that, not the Valmiki Ramayana, not the Sanskrit Ramayana. So my mother was reading that, and she was reading a book called the Bhagavata Puran, which is a much later work from the Tamil country, particularly book 10 of it, which is a kind of a biography of the god Krishna. But she was not reading the Mahabharata. And I found that nobody was reading the Mahabharata. And then I asked her why. And she said to me, you don't read the Mahabharata at home, because if you read the Mahabharata at home, you'll end up having a Mahabharata inside your home. Because what is the Mahabharata? It's a story at the most basic level of a quarrel between people who are relatives, kinsmen. The Pandavas and the Kauravas are after all related to each other, right? So this was a wonderful way of saying you don't want to read this gigantic story about the dispute between these two clans who are closely related to each other. They were actually all brought up together. The 100 Kauravas and the Pandavas, 5 Pandavas, were all brought up together. They had the same teachers, uh, and as I said, this ye kahavat, this saying that घर में महाभारत पढ़ो तो घर में महाभारत हो जाती है. If you read the Mahabharata at home, you end up creating a Mahabharata in your own home. That is, you'll engender disputes that way. I found that this was a saying that you found in many parts of India. Of course, now you could say that perhaps this view has been revised in some fashion, because after all, the Mahabharata has come into all our homes through the television serial, if no other way. And the present government is ensuring that it comes into our homes once again, because during the pandemic it's been telecast once again, right? But in any case, that was one difference. The other interesting thing is that I think that the Ramayana is in a sense held up more as an example of a text that one can use, because comparatively speaking, and I want to underscore the word comparatively speaking, the morality in the Ramayana is more unambiguous. That is that it's relatively straightforward compared to the Mahabharata. In the Mahabharata, there are no straightforward heroes. Every hero is also an anti-hero, as we're going to find out. In the Ramayana, you could say that maybe Ram displays some fatal flaws. We'll have to discuss those and see how those are interpreted. But on the whole, he is held up as the ideal ruler, ideal king, ideal father, ideal husband. Well, maybe not so much ideal father, really, but ideal husband, and ideal king and ruler. And remember that in Hindi we have a phrase, right, to express a kind of a utopian future, that is Ram Rajya. Gandhi very often invoked, although again, what Gandhi exactly meant is a matter for another discussion, but he often invoked the idea of Ram Rajya. The expression is used quite often. So, if you have an ideal kingdom where the king governs wisely, the subjects are not oppressed, uh, the well-being of every subject is what the ruler has in mind, then you say that this is Ram Rajya. It is an ideal kingdom. And that suggests to you, of course, the fact that the Ramayana came to be viewed, in comparison to the Mahabharata especially, as a work that was relatively more straightforward in its depiction of human morality and human action. Uh, it is also the case that even though the Mahabharata may have started as a kavya is a poem. So think of it this way: that I was saying the word epic is inadequate. So then, what are the words that we would use in India to describe these two works? That would be the logical question. And the Ramayana is always considered a kavya. So the word kavya is poetry. A poet is called a kavi in modern Hindi as well. And so the Mahabharata the Ramayana is considered a kavya. The Mahabharata may have started as a kavya, but it is not typically described as a kavya. It's described as itihas. The word itihas translates from Sanskrit roughly into history. However, we have to be very, very cautious here, because this is not an invitation to read the work as a work of history, not at all. um, and on this note, I want to just add something which I have sort of touched upon before in different contexts, and I will continue to touch upon this in future sessions as well. But I want to add it at this juncture, which is that you see this idea that it could be a work of history, as we understand the word history today, is a relatively modern idea. it was not really viewed that way. And the reason we should be extremely cautious about this is because there are attempts now being made by people to suggest that it actually represents historical events. Okay. Now, not only is this argument untenable, it's untenable for a large number of reasons, partially, of course, because some of the characters are clearly drawn up with enormous amount of what you might call rhetorical excess. So, if you say, I mean, just if you think, for example, about the 100, okay, children, brothers. Well, how does a woman bear 100 children? She doesn't, right? You've got you have the 100 Kauravas, after all. So it's not meant to be taken literally. The text is very clear on scores of occasions that it's not meant to be taken literally at all. For example, the Mahabharat actually tells you how many people were killed. All right? And how many people were killed? The figure given is 1.66 billion. Well, the population of India was not 1.66 billion at that point in time. You might have had maybe 1.66 million. Well, you certainly would have had 1.66 billion. And this is mentioned in Book 11, okay? Book 11, chapter 56 of the Mahabharata, which means that we have to have a way of interpreting that number, because what that author is doing, he's playing up this rhetorical excess, okay, to make it sound grandiose. So when you say the conqueror went and he killed hundreds of thousands of people, well, he might have killed 100 or 500 or 1,000, but the chronicler is giving you a grossly exaggerated number, because in a way it does credit to the conqueror to say that, hey, he killed billions or millions, not just a handful or 5,000 people, okay? What I mean to suggest by that is that, you see, it is not important to read it as a work of history, number one. Secondly, it was never read really as a work of history. Number three, having said that, I don't mean to say that some core of the story may not have actually been historical. That is, that it's possible to say that there was a war that was fought, which involved a large number of kings. Not a completely unlikely scenario. And there is a particular kind of pottery that has been discovered in some of the sites associated with the Mahabharat, which dates back to for example, 500 BCE, 700 BCE. Around the time that this Mahabharat was being composed. All right. So, in other words, we know that some of the cities that are described in the Mahabharat are cities that existed. All right. That's what I'm saying. That there may be historical elements. So when you hear about Gandhari, so who's Gandhari? Gandhari is one of the queens. Why is she called Gandhari? Because almost certainly she came from Gandhara. Gandhara is in Afghanistan. Okay, it's in Afghanistan. She almost certainly came from there, and so she gets called Gandhari. So there you can say that there are some historical elements in the Mahabharata, but that doesn't make it a work of history. Think of it, if you read a novel by Charles Dickens, and you knew nothing about the history of London, and you knew nothing about England in the 19th century, you could certainly, let's say you hadn't ever read a history book, some of it is going to give you details which obviously point to a particular city. And in this case, it's going to be London. There are some historical elements in this novel, that in a novel that he might write, okay? And of course, Dickens, you could say, is not a good example because he's perhaps a bit more of a historical novelist, but that would be true of the vast majority of works of fiction, that they are fiction, but we recognize that the author obviously draws upon history as well, not only on the imagination. In fact, how you draw upon history is also a work of imagination. All right. So we have to distinguish what may be the possibly historical elements in the Mahabharata from the argument that it is a work of history. It's not a work of history, and it shouldn't be read as that. And if we have time, we look at what Gandhi thought of that, because Gandhi was unequivocally clear in his mind. He said, it doesn't matter an iota, whether it's a work of history or not. It's completely irrelevant to a consideration of the text and the story. That's the best way to really put it. It adds absolutely nothing to it. In fact, if anything, it detracts from it if you start looking at it as a work of history. It's a work of extraordinary imagination, which certainly draws upon some historical elements, because that's what authors would do. You create from what you know from your own times as well. All right. Now, uh, here's a broad outline of the story. Very, very broad. So you have and I'm so remember the length of the text, as I've explained to you. So what you're getting is, you're getting like 1/millionth of really the Mahabharat in the core story. That's all you're getting, because that's sufficient for our purposes for the time being. And then when we move to more particular episodes, we will expound upon some of these stories, right? So you have the Kauravas and you have the Pandavas, and the Kauravas are 100 in number, and their father is Dhritarashtra. The queen, his wife, is Gandhari. Dhritarashtra is blind, and one of the things we're told about Gandhari is that because uh, her husband, the king, is blind, that she also decides to go blind. That is, that she's going to have a scarf put over her eyes. And when you see modern day retellings of the Mahabharata on television, like the one you have now, you'll see that Gandhari is always shown with a scarf over her eyes. And of course, some of the feminists have said, well, women just simply followed their husbands. Shows you how servile she was. She was obsequious. She just simply, because her husband didn't have this privilege, and so she couldn't have it, the privilege of seeing. Well, you could read it, of course, the very opposite way. You could read it the opposite way, and you could say that, well, that's an example of an extraordinarily strong moral character, someone who says that I have the courage and the sacrifice to deprive myself of a privilege that my husband doesn't have. All right. You could read it that way. So you could, and those would be the two extreme readings that we have. However, going back to the outlines of the story. So you have the Kauravas, and then you have their cousins, the Pandavas, and one thing we should always remember: ask anyone, just try it out. Ask them to name you the 100 Kauravas. No one knows. No one. Ask them to name you 90 of them. No one knows. Only two are really known by name to, to almost anyone. Sometimes only one, by the way. Duryodhan he's the oldest, and then you have Dusashan, because he's an important character in many of the um, scenes. And the Sanskrit prefix Duryodhan, Du, and Dusashan. So the Sanskrit prefix Du means bad. So you can tell from their names what their characters are going to be like. Okay, the Pandavas are 5 in number, and everyone knows all the 5. There are some people who might not recognize the 2 younger ones, the twins, but most people would recognize the 5, and certainly everyone would recognize the 3 oldest Pandavas. Okay, so you have of course Yudhishthir, and then you have uh, Bhim and Arjun. So in descending order. Okay, and then you have Nakul and Sahadev. Okay, and their father is Pandu, but the 5 are not from the same uh, mother. Okay, so you have Kunti, and when I say father, I'm going to modify that in just a moment. Okay, I'm going to modify that in just a moment, because in principle he is their father, but he's not really their father, and the reason he's not their father is because he's basically impotent, and so Kunti is one of his 2 queens. So she bears a son, Yudhishthir, and she bears it, okay, by consort, by sexual intercourse, as it were, with a god. Okay, Bhim is also born by her sexual intercourse with a god, and Arjun is likewise, okay, born by sexual intercourse with a god. The god and Kunti, okay, because Pandu is unable to bear children. So there's another interesting aspect here. Just keep that in mind. I'm just alerting you to this, just as I alerted you to the Gandhari story about the scarf, and that what I'm alerting you to is that the women in the Mahabharata are very unusual characters. And one could argue that women are the strongest characters in the epic, the strongest characters in the epic. Right? And then there are a really remarkable lot. Wendy Doniger, and that's one reason why she's, from, I read the foreword, I read the first lines from her foreword to the edition of the Mahabharata, the retelling of the Mahabharata by Carol Satyamurthy. And at that time, I mentioned to you that she's not liked in India at all. One reason she's not liked in India by the Hindu nationalists, especially, is because they say that she keeps on emphasizing the sexual aspects of all of these stories. It's the erotic element in Hindu culture that she is really appealed by. She doesn't, that attracts her. She doesn't really care about the philosophic element of it. I don't think I really agree with that. But it is interesting that in the foreword she speaks about these women very briefly, and one attention she draws to is the fact that there are a lot of the strong women characters have multiple sexual partners. If you want to put it that way. All right. But what is certainly the case is that Kunti has 3 sons with 3 different consorts, if I may use that phrase, and those 3 sons are in sequential order: Yudhishthir, Bhim, and Arjun. And then the twins are born by Madri. Their mother is Madri, so that's a second queen or second wife of Pandu. And these 2 sons, these 2 twins are called Nakul and Sahadev. All right. So these are the first set of main characters that we have. We've got the Pandavas, we've got the Kauravas. The 5 Pandavas and the Kauravas are all raised together. They're raised together in the kingdom of the Kauravas, the Kurus. Yudhishthir is the one. So Yudhishthir is also known as Dharma. He is Dharma. He is, and you know the meaning of the word by now, of course. He is Lord Dharma himself. He is the one who exemplifies morality, conduct, and he is the one who's really the one who's entitled to inherit the crown. But the Kauravas lust for this kingdom, and that is going to be the occasion for the conflict. Okay, because essentially, even though Yudhishthir is the one who's entitled, it's the Kauravas who are going to want to gain the kingdom and rule over it. Now, but as children, they grow up together, and they have the same teachers. And the teachers are also referred to as the preceptors or the elders. And most famously, you have people like Bhishma, who's kind of like a grandfatherly figure, and you have Drona. Drona is the one who is going to teach, in particular, the skills of warfare. Because remember, this is a Kshatriya clan. They're Kshatriyas. They're not Brahmins. These are people who are warriors. They're princes. They're meant to rule. And in some ways, you can think of the Mahabharata as a Kshatriya text in many ways. We'll have to see what are some of the subtleties that arise from looking at it in these terms. Whether it's what's the role of the Brahmins, what are the role of the Kshatriyas, and what does the Mahabharata tell us about things like caste, for example, and intercaste marriage? All right, but we get to that set